Welcome to a quiet journey. Before we begin, I invite you to make yourself comfortable. Perhaps dim the lights, wrap yourself in something warm, and let the pace of the day begin to slow. This is your time, a moment to breathe. If you enjoy calm stories like this, gentle wanderings through the past, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps others find this space of stillness. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment below and share your corner of the world. The night waits quietly for you. Beyond the edges of your busy day, the world begins to slow, the air cooling with the hush of evening. Somewhere in the distance, a temple bell drifts over tiled rooftops, its deep tone fading into the dark, like a memory you almost remember. Tonight, we will walk together into Kyoto's ancient streets, through winding alleys and across quiet bridges, toward the soft glow of the Lantern Festival. There will be moments where the air is heavy with the scent of incense and tea, moments where the river catches the shimmer of candlelight and sends it dancing toward the stars. Every step will carry us deeper into a world where time moves more gently, where stories live in the spaces between flickering shadows. You may hear laughter carried on the wind, the rustle of silk as kimono sleeves brush past, or the faint crackle of a paper lantern swaying overhead. The festival is not simply an event. It is a living, breathing dream. And tonight, you are part of it. So settle into the quiet. Let your breathing match the rhythm of our slow steps. And as we begin, imagine the warm light of a lantern finding you in the crowd. A small flame, steady and sure, ready to guide you home. The train slowed as it approached Kyoto, the sound of the wheels over the tracks softening until it became a gentle hum beneath your feet. Outside the window, the last blush of sunset lingered low over the horizon, pale gold melting into the first shades of blue. The mountains stood in patient silhouette, their dark shapes a quiet reminder that this land has always known seasons, festivals, and the passage of countless lives. You could almost imagine the same view centuries ago, a lone traveler approaching the city by foot, the lanterns already beginning to glow ahead. When the train doors opened, the air that greeted you was different from where you had come. It carried the faint mineral scent of stone cooled by the evening, touched with the warmth of wood and a trace of something sweet, perhaps from a nearby shop making fresh taiyaki. The platform was lined with polished wood and old beams that seemed to have absorbed years of summer nights, holding on to stories only they could tell. The murmur of people was unhurried, the tone softer than in busier cities, as though Kyoto itself asked its visitors to lower their voices. Stepping out of the station, you found yourself in streets where the day was just slipping away. Shadows stretched long, but not yet deep. The pale sky still held a wash of color, that tender moment before dusk fully claims it. Lanterns had begun to glow, their paper sides painted with cranes, flowers, or calligraphy. They swayed slightly in the faint evening breeze, casting ovals of gold on the worn stones beneath them. You began walking, the wheels of your small suitcase humming softly over the street's uneven stones. Each step seemed to join the rhythm of the city, a rhythm not dictated by traffic lights or hurried schedules, but by the quiet choreography of the festival's unfolding. On one side of the street, an elderly man sat on a low wooden stool outside his shop. The scent of roasting chestnuts drifted from the pan beside him, the shells splitting with a faint hiss. He nodded as you passed, his lined face warmed by the lantern's glow. Across from him, a narrow canal ran alongside the road, its dark surface occasionally catching the light from the windows of small tea houses. The water whispered against the stones, a sound so soft you almost had to stop to hear it. Further along, the sound of a taiko drum reached your ears, not loud, not insistent, but steady, a single heartbeat in the air, carrying across the distance. Between the drum beats, you heard other things, the faint clink of ceramic cups in a nearby cafe, the laughter of a child as she ran ahead of her parents, the rustle of summer yukata as people moved past. The scent of the air changed as you turned down a narrower lane. Incense curled lazily from a temple gate ahead, mixing with the sweet soy glaze of yakitori grilling at a food stall. A young woman in a pale blue yukata walked by, her hair pinned with a single camellia blossom. The wooden teeth of her gaiter clicked softly against the stones. She caught your eye for a moment and offered a small, almost shy smile before disappearing around the bend. You paused at the temple gate. 2 stone lanterns flanked the entrance, their carved surfaces moss-covered in places, their interiors glowing softly. Inside, you could see the faint silhouettes of people bowing before the altar, the air heavy with the perfume of incense and the stillness that only a sacred space holds. The sound of the festival did not intrude here. It seemed to stand respectfully at the edge. When you moved on, the lane opened up toward the river. You could see it from a distance, a dark ribbon beneath the sky, its surface flickering with small points of light. As you drew closer, you saw that those lights were lanterns, hundreds of them, each one drifting with the slow current. They glowed gold, then silver as they shifted with the water, creating a living tapestry of light and reflection. Families knelt by the river's edge, their hands gently releasing new lanterns onto the water. Some spoke in whispers, others in silence, their faces lit by the small flames inside the paper shells. There was a tenderness in these gestures, as if each lantern carried more than just a light, perhaps a prayer, a memory, or the name of someone no longer here. You set your suitcase down for a moment, simply standing there, letting the scene wash over you. The air was cooler by the water, carrying with it the smell of wet stone and summer grass. The voices around you blurred into a low murmur, blending with the rhythmic splash of oars from a small boat passing downstream. The taiko drum called again, closer now, and you felt it in your chest as much as you heard it. It seemed to beckon, guiding you away from the river and deeper into the heart of the city. You turned reluctantly, casting one last glance at the drifting lights, then began to walk toward the sound. The streets ahead were lined with more lanterns. Their shapes varied, some round like moons, others long and cylindrical, a few shaped like animals or flowers. Shop windows glowed warmly, and you caught glimpses of festival masks, silk fans, and delicate sweets wrapped in leaves. In one small shop, a craftsman sat behind the counter, painting the final strokes on a new lantern. His brush moved slowly, each curve of ink deliberate, as though this lantern, too, might one day carry someone's hopes across water. The crowd began to thicken, yet there was no push or hurry. People walked at an unspoken pace, their steps falling into the same measured rhythm. You realized that you too had slowed, not from fatigue, but because there was no need to move faster. The festival was not something to be rushed toward. It was something to be received, moment by moment. Somewhere ahead, the drums rolled into a longer beat, and the faint sound of flutes joined them. You could imagine the procession, lantern bearers moving in time with the music, their faces serene in the glow, the air alive with the soft jingle of bells and the rustle of silk. But for now, you could only hear it, the sound weaving through the night, like a promise that the best was yet to come. You rounded another corner, the glow of the street seeming to gather in the air itself. Here, Kyoto felt both old and eternal, as though this night could have belonged to any century. The stones beneath your feet had been worn smooth by the passing of generations, and the air seemed to remember each one. Somewhere deep inside, you felt yourself settling, as if the gentle arrival was not just into the city, but into a slower, quieter way of being. The journey had begun, not with spectacle, but with stillness, lantern light, and the distant call of drums that would guide you deeper into the night. You passed beneath an archway of wooden beams, strung with small bells. The faint chime they made in the breeze was almost too delicate to hear, a silver thread woven into the night's tapestry of sound. Beyond it, the street narrowed again, the lanterns hanging lower, close enough that their paper skins brushed the tops of taller heads. Their light painted warm circles on the paving stones, where centuries of footsteps had polished the rock to a muted sheen. To your left, a low doorway led into a tea house. Through its half-open shoji screens, you saw women in kimono kneeling gracefully at low tables, pouring steaming matcha into lacquer bowls. The tea's green foam caught the lantern light for a heartbeat before it was lifted to waiting hands. The room inside seemed wrapped in its own world, the clink of ceramic, the quiet murmur of voices, the scent of roasted tea leaves. Outside, a vendor ladled steaming broth into paper cups, the air around his stall fragrant with ginger and scallions. A young boy clutched his cup carefully, blowing on the surface before taking a sip. His eyes widened in pleasure, and he looked up at his father with a grin that said the warmth was more than just from the soup. The drum beats returned, steadier now, joined by the soft, plucked notes of a shamisen. You followed them as if they were a trail, each beat a note, pulling you closer to the heart of something you couldn't yet see. As you walked, you began to notice the way the city shifted with every turn. One street opened into a small courtyard where a maple tree stretched its branches over the stones, its leaves catching stray lantern light like tiny, flickering jewels. Another lane was lined with stalls selling sweets in shapes so delicate they could have been carved from porcelain, rabbits, plum blossoms, tiny cranes. The vendor placed one in a small paper box for a customer, folding the corners so precisely it looked like origami. The air grew cooler again as you reached the edge of another canal. Here, the lanterns reflected in the water with startling clarity, as though the river had become a path of light leading away into the dark. A young couple stood together on the stone bridge, their fingers entwined, speaking in hushed tones. The breeze lifted the woman's hair, and for a moment it shimmered with the glow of a passing lantern. Further along, you came upon a small stage set beneath a canopy of pine boughs. Musicians sat cross-legged, their instruments resting lightly in their hands. The taiko player's arms moved in a graceful arc before each strike, his face serene, the sound rolling out like distant thunder. Beside him, a flutist's breath turned into music so soft it felt like it might dissolve into the air before reaching your ears. You stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, letting the music wash over you. There was no applause, no sharp break between pieces. The music simply was, as much a part of the night as the scent of cedar, the glow of lanterns, and the murmur of the river. An elderly woman in the crowd turned toward you, her eyes bright beneath her wrinkled lids. She nodded once, as though to say, "Yes, this is the way in." She carried a single unlit lantern in her hands, the paper painted with a cluster of chrysanthemums. You had the sudden sense that she knew exactly where she was going, and that she had walked this way many times before. When she moved on, you followed at a respectful distance. The crowd thinned as you turned into a quieter street. Here, the lanterns were spaced farther apart, and the darkness between them felt softer, more private. Somewhere above, the faint creak of wooden shutters told of someone leaning out to watch the night below. You realized you had slowed almost to a halt. The air was thick with that in-between stillness, not silence, but the deep, breathing quiet that comes when a place has settled fully into itself. You could feel it in your chest, as if your own heartbeat had begun to match the slower rhythm of the city. The elderly woman disappeared through a temple gate. You paused outside, watching as she knelt to light her lantern from the small flame at the altar. She held it there for a moment, eyes closed, before rising and carrying it to the water's edge inside the temple grounds. There, she set it afloat, the small light drifting away with a dozen others, their reflections trembling in the ripples. You did not follow her inside, but stood at the gate, your hands resting lightly on the wooden frame. The grain beneath your fingers was smooth from countless other hands, the wood warm where the lantern's light touched it. Somewhere far off, another drum called, and the sound felt like the closing of a circle, a signal that your first steps into Kyoto had been taken. You turned back toward the street, where the lanterns swayed gently in the night breeze, their glow waiting to guide you onward. As you walked away, you realized that you had arrived not just in a city, not just at a festival, but in a rhythm of being that you could already feel settling into your bones. The rest of the night awaited, and with it, the promise of countless small wonders, each one no louder than a lantern's glow, but just as enduring. The lane curved downward, and the sound of water came before the sight of it, a patient murmur beneath the city's layers of voices, footsteps, and music. As you approached, the lanterns grew more numerous, their light thickening the air in warm golds and pale ambers. You found yourself among people carrying them in careful hands, each one a small sun held close to the heart. The canal was narrow here, its stone banks dark with age. Moss clung to the edges like a memory that refused to fade. The surface of the water was smooth and waiting, reflecting only the nearest lights as though reluctant to give away its secrets too soon. At the head of the bank, a wooden platform had been built for the evening. Monks in saffron robes moved with unhurried grace, their bare feet silent on the planks. Each held a thin stick of incense, its thread of smoke winding upward into the night. Before them, a low table held rows of unlit lanterns, their papers painted with scenes from nature, pine groves leaping carp, blossoms falling through the air. You joined the others in a slow, almost instinctive queue. No one spoke above a murmur. The moment asked for something quieter than words. The family before you, a mother, father, and small daughter, stepped forward together. The girl's kimono sleeves brushed against her lantern, painted with a single white crane in flight. The monk leaned down, spoke softly to her, and lit the candle inside with a match shielded carefully in his hands. Her eyes widened as the paper walls bloomed with light, the painted crane seeming to take on the warmth of life. When it was your turn, the monk met your gaze with a brief, knowing nod. He held out a lantern painted with a cluster of red maple leaves, their edges touched in gold. The flame caught with a quiet pop and then steadied, its glow softening the lines of your fingers as you cradled the bamboo frame. The bank sloped gently into the water. You stepped down until the cool stones met the soles of your sandals. The river's breath touched your ankles, and you lowered the lantern until its base floated free. For a moment it wavered, caught in the balance between your hands and the current, and then the water claimed it, carrying it slowly into the dark, where other lights already drifted. You watched it join the procession. Each lantern, once released, seemed to take on a will of its own, some hugging the bank, others venturing toward the middle where the reflections deepened. The first 20 or so moved with measured distance between them, each a solitary star on the surface. Then more joined, and more still, until the river began to resemble a constellation breaking apart and reforming in gentle swirls. The monks began chanting, low, even syllables that rolled outward over the water like ripples of sound. You couldn't understand the words, but the tone carried something timeless, as though it had been sung here for generations beyond counting. People stood still to listen, lanterns cradled against their chests, their faces soft with reflection. A wind rose briefly, stirring the incense smoke and causing the lanterns to sway, their reflections shivering in answer. A child somewhere gasped, not in fear, but in delight, as if the river itself had just spoken. The air was rich with mingled scents, sandalwood, river damp, and the faint sweetness of plum wine from a nearby stall. A woman passed behind you, her wooden sandals clicking against the stones, carrying a small tray with 2 steaming cups. She offered one to an elderly man seated at the edge of the platform, his hands wrapped in a faded scarf. He took it with a bow so deep it seemed a part of the night's ritual. By now, the river was thick with light. From a distance, it might have looked like a single, unbroken ribbon of gold winding through the city. But up close, you could still see each lantern's unique painting, its own tiny universe drifting beside the others. Somewhere behind you, the taiko drums began again, softer now, as though played with the padded side of the sticks. The beat matched the river's pace, steady and unhurried, and the flutes returned in threads of melody that curled like smoke. You felt the sound in your bones, in the air, in the water. One lantern drifted close enough for you to see the brush strokes in its design, a crescent moon above 3 tall grasses bending in the wind. It caught for a moment against a stone, its flame flickering, then freed itself and moved on. You found yourself silently wishing it well, as if it were a traveler, setting off on a journey you would never see the end of. The monks' chant deepened, joined now by the voices of some in the crowd. The syllables rose and fell, not in perfect unison, but in a way that felt more alive, more human. The river seemed to listen, carrying the sound downstream along with the light. You stayed until your own lantern was no longer visible, lost among the hundreds that now floated toward the next bend. Only then did you step back from the bank, feeling as though you had placed a part of yourself into the water along with it. You stepped back into the crowd, letting the river reclaim your place at its edge. Around you, people lingered as if unwilling to leave, their faces turned toward the drifting lights. A man in a dark yukata adjusted the strap of his camera and lifted it slowly, not to capture the lanterns, but to frame the profile of the woman beside him. She laughed softly when she realized, her hand rising to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Vendors had begun to light their own paper lamps above their stalls, casting honey-colored pools onto the cobblestones. The nearest stand sold grilled ayu, the fish skewered on thin sticks and roasted over an open flame until their skin blistered and browned. The air there was richer now, the scent of char mingling with the sharper fragrance of fresh shiso leaves arranged on the platters. You drifted between groups, your steps slow enough to catch fragments of conversations. A young couple discussing which bend in the river might offer the best view. An older man telling his grandson about the year the festival lanterns floated all the way out into the lake beyond Kyoto, how he had followed them until the last light winked out at dawn. At the far end of the riverbank, you found another release point. This one was quieter, with fewer people, as though it were reserved for those who had brought their own lanterns from home. A woman in a pale green kimono knelt by the water, her hands steady as she set afloat a lantern painted entirely with calligraphy. The black ink stood out sharply against the paper, each character flowing into the next, like the current it now joined. She stayed kneeling long after it had gone, her reflection rippling beside the lanterns. The drums had faded again, replaced by the delicate sound of a koto. The musician sat cross-legged beneath a low awning, the instrument's 13 strings stretched over its polished wood. Her fingers moved with patient precision, coaxing notes that seemed to fall directly into the water, where they lingered a moment before dissolving into the night. The lanterns, too, had slowed. The earlier ones had reached a place where the current widened, and now they bunched together, some spinning gently in place, others slipping forward in slow arcs. The light was more concentrated here, almost too bright to look at without blinking. The river's surface seemed to carry not just reflections, but whole constellations that trembled when the breeze touched them. Children edged forward to watch, their parents holding their hands loosely, letting them feel the pull of the moment. One boy reached out as if to touch a passing lantern, then drew back when his mother whispered something in his ear. His eyes widened in the way of someone who had just been told a story that would follow him into adulthood. You stayed there longer than you expected, the cool stone beneath your feet grounding you against the drifting of time. When you finally turned away, you walked slowly up the bank, your gaze still drawn to the water. Each step carried the faint sense of moving away from something sacred. The streets beyond were warmer now, the festival fully awake. Stalls selling fans, sweets, and trinkets had their own lines of waiting customers. You stopped at one to admire the painted uchiwa, flat fans decorated with seasonal scenes. The vendor, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, told you each one had been hand-painted by her family for 3 generations. She pressed one into your hand, a night river with lanterns drifting under a bridge, and refused your offer of payment, saying simply, "A gift for the journey." By the time you reached the main bridge, the view upstream was breathtaking. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of lanterns moved as one glowing tapestry. The bridge itself had become a gathering place, its wooden railings lined with people leaning forward, their faces illuminated from below. A small boy sat atop his father's shoulders, pointing out patterns he thought he saw among the drifting lights. A dragon, a turtle, a winding path into the stars. Below the bridge, the water caught and multiplied the sounds of the night. The low hum of voices, the occasional clap of hands, the faint echo of drums returning from somewhere deeper in the city. You leaned against the railing, letting it all settle into you. The warmth of the wood against your arms, the scent of river air mixed with candle wax. From here, you could see that the lantern's journey was far from over. Downstream, they would pass under another bridge, then slip into a stretch of river lined with willow trees, their branches dipping into the current. Beyond that, the water would curve out of sight, carrying the lights into a darkness you could only imagine. Someone beside you whispered, "They say the lanterns guide the spirits back to the other world." You turned to see an older woman speaking to a young girl who held a folded fan against her chest. "But I think," the woman continued, "they guide us too. Remind us of where we've come from, and maybe of where we're going." You stayed until the koto's final notes faded, until the last cup of tea in your hands had gone cold, until the lanterns below were no longer individual lights, but a single, endless glow. Only then did you step away from the bridge, your pace unhurried, as though a part of you had taken on the lantern's own drifting grace. The river remained behind, but its presence followed you in the sound of moving water that lingered in your ears, in the faint warmth on your palms where the lantern had rested, and in the quiet certainty that its light was still moving somewhere out there in the night. The bridge fell away behind you, yet its wooden warmth still lingered faintly against your palm. followed the curve of the river where the crowd thinned, stepping onto a path edged by soft grass and stones, worn smooth by countless footsteps. Above, the night sky had deepened into a velvety indigo, and the moon hung low, its reflection rippling beside the lanterns as they drifted toward this quieter stretch. Willow trees lined both sides of the water here, their long green tendrils trailing into the current like threads of silk. A light breeze moved through them, making the branches sway in slow arcs, brushing the surface of the river as if in greeting to the passing lights. Each time the leaves touched the water, tiny ripples spread outward, bending the lantern's reflections for a heartbeat before they straightened again. Your footsteps slowed until they matched the rhythm of the water. This path felt different from the bustling festival streets. Here, the voices were softer, the music a distant echo. The scent in the air shifted too. Gone was the richness of grilled fish and sweet confections, replaced by the fresh coolness of river plants and the faint, earthy perfume of moss. You paused beneath a particularly old willow, its trunk thick and gnarled. Lantern light dappled its bark, the patterns shifting as the water moved below. A man stood there, sketchbook in hand, his pencil whispering across the paper. He glanced up, offered a brief nod, and returned to his work, capturing not the lanterns themselves, but the shapes they made in the shadows between the branches. Further along, you came upon a small gathering. A group of monks in simple robes stood at the water's edge, each holding a lantern cupped between their palms. They murmured prayers in low, steady voices before releasing the lights, which bobbed gently into the current and joined the slow procession downstream. The sound of their chanting lingered in the air long after they stepped back into the shadows. The willow path seemed to encourage this, small, quiet moments of release and reflection. You saw a woman kneel to set her lantern afloat, her face turned away as she whispered something you couldn't quite catch. A few steps later, an elderly man sat alone on a bench, his cane resting against his knee, his gaze fixed on a single lantern, as though following it across an invisible distance. The path narrowed where the roots of the willows reached toward the water, forcing you to step carefully between them. In one place, a shallow pool had formed, capturing a handful of drifting blossoms from an earlier breeze. The petals floated like fragments of moonlight, their edges tinged with gold from the nearest lanterns. Up ahead, the river bent sharply, and the lanterns gathered into a tighter cluster as the current drew them around the curve. You moved with them, your steps almost in sync with the slow sweep of their journey. At the apex of the bend stood a small wooden pavilion, open on all sides and supported by beams polished smooth from years of hands resting on them. Inside, a lone musician sat cross-legged, playing a shakuhachi flute. The notes were low and breathy, each one carrying far beyond the pavilion into the willow-lined night. They rose and fell like sighs, the pauses between them as important as the sound itself. You leaned against one of the beams and listened, the river murmuring in quiet harmony beneath the melody. A child's laughter pulled your attention back to the water. Just beyond the pavilion, a father lifted his daughter high enough for her to lean over and watch the lanterns pass beneath her dangling feet. She clapped her hands each time a brightly painted one came into view, calling out the colors in a voice so clear it seemed to ring against the surface of the water. Moving on, you found that the path here began to rise slightly, offering a higher view of the river. From this vantage, the lanterns resembled a long, winding ribbon of firelight, weaving between the shadows of the trees. You could see where they would soon pass under another bridge, smaller than the one you had left behind, and disappear briefly from sight. You stopped at a bench carved into the hillside, settling there to watch. The lanterns moved unhurriedly, their light brushing against the undersides of the willow branches. Now and then, a branch would catch one just enough to spin it lazily before letting it go. In those moments, the flame inside flickered wildly, sending arcs of gold dancing across the water. The people here spoke little, their voices hushed as though the willows themselves asked for silence. You could hear other sounds more clearly, the rustle of leaves, the occasional splash of a fish, the faint tap of bamboo wind chimes hung from a nearby tree. They swayed gently, adding their thin, clear voices to the night's music. Time seemed to slow in this place. You sat long enough for the moon to climb higher, for the shadows to shift across the path. The air cooled further, carrying with it the faint scent of tea from somewhere beyond the trees. When you rose again, it was not because the scene had lost its beauty, but because the ribbon of lanterns was slipping toward the next turn, and part of you felt bound to follow. As you walked, the path widened again, the ground leveling out near the smaller bridge. Children leaned over its railings, their faces bright with the reflected light from below. A young boy released a paper boat shaped like a crane, its interior holding a single tea candle. Though it was not as bright as the larger lanterns, it held its own, gliding with quiet dignity into the cluster of lights. You lingered on the bridge just long enough to watch the crane-shaped boat vanish into the glow, then continued on the opposite bank. The willows gave way here to open stretches of grass, where families had spread out blankets to sit and watch the night unfold. Some sipped tea from small ceramic cups, others shared quiet meals, their eyes never far from the water. Beyond them, a narrow flight of stone steps led down to the river's edge. You descended slowly, feeling the cool dampness of the stones beneath your hands as you steadied yourself. At the bottom, you stood close enough to hear the faint hiss of the candles burning inside the lanterns. Their flames seemed impossibly fragile, yet each one held steady against the night air. You crouched there for a while, watching as the current carried the lights past. Every so often, two lanterns would drift close enough for their paper edges to touch, their combined glow flaring briefly before they parted again. It felt like watching chance meetings, brief but significant, before each continued on its own path. When you finally stood, the willow path stretched behind you in a gentle arc, its shadows deep and full of memory. Ahead lay new turns in the river, new places where the lanterns would gather, scatter, and gather again. You followed them, your steps as unhurried as the water's flow, knowing that the night still held many quiet wonders yet to be found. The night had deepened, the sky now a velvet canopy, where the lantern light below seemed to rival the stars above. You had walked for some time away from the main festival streets, following narrower paths where the crowds thinned and the sounds of drums and laughter became softer, like music heard through a paper wall. A narrow lane curved ahead, the cobblestones glistening faintly under the soft glow of a few scattered lanterns. The air here was cooler, carrying with it the mingled scents of night-blooming jasmine and the faint tang of moss-covered stone. You could hear the quiet rush of a small stream somewhere beyond the darkened houses, its voice hushed yet insistent. The lane ended at a low wooden gate, half hidden by overgrown ivy and climbing wisteria. A small sign, hand-painted and faded with age, bore three simple characters you could not read. For a moment, you hesitated. The gate stood slightly ajar, its hinges whispering in the breeze, as if extending an unspoken invitation. You stepped inside. The sound of the festival fell away almost instantly, replaced by a deep stillness that felt almost physical. It was not the empty silence of absence, but the living silence of a place long protected. Here, the air was heavier, fragrant with damp earth and the sweet green scent of leaves. The garden opened before you, like a secret revealed only to those willing to look for it. Winding stone paths glistened faintly where droplets from the wisteria's blossoms had fallen. The lanterns here were few, their light subdued, their paper skins painted with delicate brush strokes, cranes in flight, bamboo in wind, a mountain half veiled in cloud. Each lantern seemed to hum with a quiet dignity, their flames barely trembling. You followed the path, your steps slow, deliberate. On one side, a koi pond stretched into the shadows. Its surface reflected not the bright chaos of the festival, but the cool, unbroken silver of the moon. Every so often, a koi would rise just beneath the surface, its movement distorting the moon's reflection into a gentle ripple before vanishing again. Their scales caught the lantern light as they turned, flashing gold and white like coins scattered in deep water. The pond was edged by low stones, smoothed over time by rain and wind. A wooden bench, simple and unadorned, rested beneath a pine whose branches reached out over the water like the hands of an old storyteller. You sat there for a time, feeling the cool grain of the bench beneath your fingers, watching as the lantern light slid slowly across the pond's mirrored surface. Somewhere deeper in the garden, a bamboo waterspout clattered softly as it tipped and emptied, then filled again with a measured patience. That sound, the gentle rush of water followed by the wooden knock, seemed to measure time differently here. Not in seconds, but in breaths. The path led on, winding between clusters of camellia and azalea. Their blossoms, though muted in the night, still offered a faint perfume that drifted up with each step. Moss carpeted the ground beneath them, thick and lush, holding the night's coolness like a secret. You came upon a stone lantern, taller than your shoulder, its weathered surface mottled with lichen. Inside, the candle's flame glowed steadily, casting a warm light that caught in the shallow carvings along its edges. Tiny figures of foxes, their eyes turned toward the pond as though guarding it. You reached out, your fingers brushing the rough stone, feeling the chill of centuries in its surface. Beyond the lantern, the garden narrowed to a wooden bridge no wider than your shoulders. Its railing was made of smooth, pale bamboo, bound neatly with dark cord. Beneath it, the stream you had heard earlier whispered over polished stones, carrying fallen petals downstream like small, fragile boats. You leaned over to watch them drift, wondering if they would eventually meet the lanterns released into the main river beyond the garden walls. The bridge led to a tea house, small and low, with sliding doors of rice paper that glowed faintly from within. You could hear the soft clink of porcelain and the low murmur of voices, not conversation exactly, but the kind of wordless acknowledgement exchanged between people who share the same space without needing to fill it. Inside, a single figure moved gracefully, an elderly woman in a pale indigo kimono, her hair pinned in a loose knot. She inclined her head when she saw you, and without a word, gestured toward a cushion set near the window. You removed your shoes and settled there, your knees folding easily into the soft tatami. She brought you tea without asking, a small ceramic cup whose glaze shifted in color between jade and soft gray. The steam rose in thin, fragrant spirals, carrying the scent of roasted leaves and something faintly floral. The first sip was warm and grounding, its flavor deep and layered, like a story told in 3 parts, beginning, middle, and lingering end. Through the open window, you could see the pond again, now from a higher vantage. The koi glided beneath the moonlight, their movements unhurried, their presence a reminder that life here moved to a rhythm untouched by festival drums or hurried footsteps. For a long time, neither you nor the woman spoke. the garden did not require words to explain itself. It asked only that you be still enough to notice the way the lantern's light shifted as the breeze moved through the branches, or how the bamboo waterspout's rhythm seemed to match the rise and fall of your breath. When you finally stood to leave, she walked you to the door, pausing only to slide it open with the same quiet grace she had shown all evening. Outside, the garden waited, unchanged. The air felt cooler now, the scents of pine and damp stone more pronounced. You retraced your steps across the bridge, past the stone lantern and the pond, until the low wooden gate came into view once more. As you stepped back into the narrow lane, the sounds of the festival returned, faint at first, then gradually swelling until they wrapped around you like a familiar robe. Yet something of the hidden garden stayed with you. It was in the slowed pace of your steps, in the way your hands still remembered the smooth grain of the teacup, in the quiet certainty that you had been allowed to touch something rare, something both fragile and enduring. And as you moved toward the heart of the festival once more, you carried with you the garden's stillness, a light of a different kind, one that would not be set adrift on the river, but kept within. The night in Kyoto has deepened into a soft velvet sky, pierced by the warm glow of 1,000 lanterns. You can feel the shift in the air, a subtle stirring, as if the city itself is holding its breath in anticipation. Somewhere far off, the muffled thump of a taiko drum reaches you, steady and unhurried, like the slow heartbeat of the festival. You walk along the narrow street that leads toward the main avenue where the procession will soon pass. The stones beneath your feet are worn smooth from centuries of travelers, each step you take joining a quiet rhythm of countless footsteps before you. The wooden houses on either side lean inward slightly, their dark lattice windows lit from within, silhouettes moving gently behind shoji screens. Somewhere, a door slides open, releasing the fragrance of simmering miso and grilled fish into the cool night air. The closer you draw to the main street, the more the sounds gather, the mingling murmur of voices, the distant rustle of fabric, the faint rhythmic clinking of metal bells. The crowd thickens gradually, not in a rush, but like a river slowly widening as tributaries join it. Children sit on their parents' shoulders, paper fans in hand, eyes already darting toward the bend in the road where the first lantern bearers will appear. You find a place near the edge of the crowd, beside a low stone wall covered in moss. Its damp scent rises faintly, grounding you in the moment. All around, people speak in low tones, laughter rippling through in soft bursts. But no one is impatient. There is an unspoken understanding here. The procession is not a spectacle to consume, but an offering to witness. The first sound to truly pierce the night comes from the flute, a single lingering note that hangs in the air like a ribbon of moonlight. It is followed by the deep, resonant boom of the taiko drum, slow and deliberate, each beat separated by a pause long enough for silence to bloom in between. Then, out of the darkness at the far end of the street, the first lanterns appear. They are not hurried. They sway slightly with the measured steps of the bearers, each flame enclosed in paper painted with delicate patterns, waves, chrysanthemums, cranes in flight. The light they cast is not bright and sharp, but soft and breathing, like candlelight seen through a memory. Behind them, more lanterns come into view, their glow multiplying until the entire street is bathed in a moving river of gold. The bearers walk in perfect unison, their feet making the faintest shuffling sound against the stones. Their robes are simple, undyed cotton bound with dark sashes, their expressions serene. Each step is deliberate, as though they are measuring not the distance of the road, but the space between moments. Following the lantern bearers are the musicians, flutists with their instruments held gently, each note rising like a sigh from deep within the stillness. The taiko drummers come next, their bodies swaying with the rhythm, arms rising and falling in graceful arcs. The drums do not shout, they speak. Each beat feels like it reaches beyond the ear, settling somewhere in the chest where it becomes your own heartbeat. The crowd watches in reverent silence. A few older women bow their heads slightly as the procession passes, their lips moving in quiet prayer. You notice an elderly man beside you, his hands folded, eyes glistening in the lantern light. There is a tenderness in the way he watches, as if the procession is not just a ritual, but a memory returned to him. Behind the musicians come the shrine bearers, carrying a small mikoshi, a portable Shinto shrine adorned with gilded ornaments that catch the lantern light. Its weight is shared among a group of men and women, their shoulders pressing into the thick wooden beams. They move in unison, their voices rising together in short chants that mark each step. The mikoshi sways gently, as if in time with the rhythm of the city's breathing. The air is thick with the scent of incense drifting from somewhere unseen. It mingles with the faint perfume of summer blossoms carried on the night breeze, jasmine perhaps, or gardenia, and the earthy smell of the stones cooling after the day's heat. The senses blur into each other until the scene feels less like something you are watching and more like something you are inside. As the procession continues, you realize how slowly it moves. There is no urgency, no desire to reach the end quickly. The journey itself is the purpose. Each group within the procession passes by with the same measured pace, and between them are long spaces of darkness where the street seems to fall silent before the next wave of light arrives. In those pauses, the crowd shifts slightly, the rustle of kimono fabric and the soft creak of wooden gaiter, filling the space like quiet punctuation marks. One of these pauses stretches longer than the others, and in the stillness, you notice the sky. Clouds have thinned, revealing a handful of stars scattered above the rooftops. The moon is just a pale sliver tonight, letting the lanterns be the brighter moons of the earth. Somewhere behind you, a child whispers a question to his mother, and her answer comes as a murmur, her voice wrapping around him like a blanket. When the next group arrives, it is a line of dancers. Their robes are patterned in indigo and white, their sleeves long and flowing, catching the lantern light as they move. Their steps are small, precise, yet fluid, and their hands trace graceful arcs in the air, each gesture deliberate and rooted in tradition. They dance not to entertain, but to embody the festival's spirit, a dance as offering, as remembrance, as gratitude. A little girl at the edge of the street mimics their movements, her face lit with concentration. One of the dancers catches her eye and smiles, a fleeting connection across the boundary of performance and audience. The girl giggles and hides behind her father's leg, peeking out again when she thinks no one is watching. Further along, a group of men carry long poles adorned with clusters of paper strips that flutter like pale moths. They sway the poles gently, creating a soft rustling sound that mingles with the music. The paper strips, you realize, are prayers, each one written by a hand that wished for something, offered it to the night, and now lets it drift into the air. The street grows narrower ahead, and the procession seems to draw even closer to the crowd. You can see the textures now, the grain of the wooden poles, the slight wrinkles in the paper lanterns, the beads of sweat on the drummers' temples. Yet even in this closeness, there is no sense of intrusion. The festival holds a space where intimacy and respect coexist. The mikoshi returns into view, carried by a different group now. Its golden phoenix atop the roof glows like it has been lit from within. The bearers' chants rise in strength as they pass, their voices blending with the steady heartbeat of the drums. For a moment, the air feels thick with something you cannot name, reverence perhaps, or a shared sense of belonging to a moment larger than any one person. As the last lanterns approach, the music softens, the drums fading into longer pauses between beats. The final group carries nothing but small, unadorned candles in shallow bowls, their flames steady despite the night breeze. They walk with their heads bowed slightly, each step slower than the last, until they reach the end of the street and vanish into the darkness beyond. The crowd remains still for a long moment after they pass. It feels wrong to break the spell too soon. Then gradually conversations resume, feet begin to shuffle, and people drift away into side streets. You remain by the moss-covered wall, the scent of damp stone and incense still in the air. The memory of the light lingers, not as an image, but as a warmth in the chest. Somewhere in the distance, the drums sound once more, softer now, as if calling only to those who are still listening. And you realize that you are. First whisper of night's cool breath drifted in from the river long before the crowd gathered at its banks. From the narrow lanes of Kyoto's older quarters, the streets opened like a slow, unfurling fan, leading pilgrims, neighbors, and travelers toward the gentle curve of water that had held the city's stories for centuries. Here, the Lantern Festival would reach its most intimate and tender moment, the floating of the lights. Vendors' calls softened as the evening deepened. The crackle of skewered yakitori on small braziers faded into the background, replaced by the steady murmuring of feet on worn cobblestones. Shadows lengthened, stretching between the pillars of riverside tea houses, and the glow from within each shoji window seemed to bow in quiet respect for what was about to unfold. The air was damp with the scent of moss and wood, mixed with faint traces of incense wafting from unseen altars deep within the district. Along the riverbank, families knelt together, their hands wrapped gently around the delicate paper frames of unlit lanterns. The paper was so thin, it almost trembled at the touch, painted in tender strokes of red, gold, or indigo, each color a prayer, each brushstroke a memory. Small children clutched their creations with a seriousness beyond their years, watching the elders for the quiet signal to begin. Beyond them, the river waited. It moved with a lazy confidence, its surface reflecting the sky's last band of soft lavender light. A heron stood poised in the shallows, still as a statue, the reflection of its long neck wavering gently in the ripples. Somewhere upstream, the sound of a wooden oar knocking softly against the side of a small boat carried through the air. An elderly man in a faded indigo kimono stepped forward. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were walking not just into the present moment, but through layers of time, carrying with him the memories of decades of lanterns sent across this same stretch of water. He set down a small wooden tray bearing a single candle, cupped in a paper shade painted with chrysanthemums. He touched the match to the wick. The flame bloomed, golden and steady, and the crowd seemed to exhale all at once. Lantern by lantern, others followed. A chain of flickers began to form, little pools of light blooming in dozens of hands. The murmured voices softened into near silence, and the only sounds were the gentle hiss of matches and the faint pop of wicks catching fire. Each new flame painted a face in warm light, cheekbones, closed eyelids, the faintest glimmer of moisture along a lower lash line. The first lantern was lowered to the water. It drifted for a moment in place, bobbing slightly, the ripples nudging it away from the shore like a parent guiding a child's first steps. Then, slowly, it began to move with the current, its golden heart reflecting across the water in trembling strands. More lanterns followed, some carrying painted prayers in brushwork that swirled like wind through tall grass, others bearing only the pure emptiness of light and paper. Parents guided their children's hands, lowering the glowing shapes into the cool touch of the river. An elderly woman leaned forward, her back curved like a question mark, her lips moving in a silent blessing as she released hers. The river became a slow parade. Lanterns, each with its own secret burden of memory or hope, drifted side by side, never quite touching, yet sharing the same journey. The water carried them gently, but with purpose, weaving them past darkened reeds and beneath low wooden bridges where watchers leaned over in reverence. From where I stood, the sight was a tapestry in motion. The glow of the lanterns formed a ribbon of light that curled and swayed with the current. Around me, the crowd seemed to dissolve into a single breath, drawn together not by noise or spectacle, but by the delicate act of letting go. A hush lingered over the bank, broken only by the rustle of robes and the faint creak of the wooden docks under shifting feet. Somewhere behind us, the slow beat of a taiko drum began again, a heartbeat to accompany the drifting lights. The rhythm was unhurried, as if reminding us that time, like the river, moves at its own pace. For some, this was an act of remembrance, a farewell to loved ones whose voices had become echoes. For others, it was an offering of gratitude, a whispered thank you to the unseen guardians of their lives. And for a few, it was simply a moment of beauty, an act of existing within the soft embrace of light and water. As the lanterns floated farther downstream, the bank seemed to lean forward collectively, following them with their gaze. The smallest children had been lifted onto shoulders so they could watch, their wide eyes reflecting the drifting glow. Couples stood hand in hand, their silence speaking more than words could. A young monk, his head newly shaven, murmured sutras under his breath, each one dissolving into the night air like the faint scent of sandalwood. The river's surface began to mirror the night sky. The lanterns below and the stars above mingled in reflection, indistinguishable at first glance. It was as if the heavens had dipped their fingers into the water, scattering their light into the flow. The further the lanterns traveled, the more they became part of that greater constellation, their small flames joining something infinite. In the stillness, time stretched. The air was cool against my skin, carrying the earthy scent of riverbank soil. The sound of the water's movement, that gentle, unending murmur, wrapped around us like a lullaby. The scene demanded no applause, no crescendo, only the quiet acceptance of what was. Slowly, the crowd began to shift, not out of impatience, but in the natural ebb of things. Some returned to the narrow streets, seeking warmth in tea houses or food stalls. Others lingered at the bank, eyes still fixed on the dwindling line of lights. The heron, which had remained unmoving throughout, stepped gracefully along the shallows, its long toes barely disturbing the surface. The lanterns, now far downstream, had begun to merge into a single soft glow. Their individual stories were no longer visible, yet their shared light was still felt, even as the river carried them beyond sight. I remained for a while longer, my gaze following the curve of the river until it disappeared into the darkened horizon. The taiko drum had stopped, the voices had faded. All that remained was the water, the night, and the lingering warmth of 1,000 small flames carried into the unknown. And then, with a slow inhale, I turned from the river and began to walk back into the winding streets, the glow of the lanterns still alive somewhere within me. The night had ripened into a soft, enveloping darkness, the kind that felt not like an absence of light, but rather a gentle quilt stitched with the faintest silver threads of starlight. Above Kyoto, The sky was a deep indigo canvas brushed with the haze of late summer warmth, and the moon hung low and round, casting a pale sheen over rooftops and temple spires. But down by the river, the true illumination came not from the heavens, but from hundreds upon hundreds of flickering lanterns, each one a heartbeat afloat upon the gentle current. The river was still at first glance, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile lights resting upon its skin. Yet, if one leaned closer, the surface revealed the slow, secret pull of water moving onward, carrying with it the wishes, memories, and silent farewells written on paper and wood. People stood along the grassy banks, their faces lit in warm, amber glows, hands folded in quiet reverence. The air was heavy with the scent of water and incense, a mingling of earth and spirit that seemed to rise from the river itself. A woman in a pale lavender yukata knelt at the edge, her sleeves pooling like petals in the dirt. She held her lantern carefully, cradling it as one might hold a sleeping child. Her lips moved in a whisper, perhaps a name, perhaps a prayer, and then, with the lightest push, she set it afloat. The small flame trembled once, caught a breath of wind, and steadied itself. It joined the slow procession, its reflection doubling the light in the water. Farther down, a boy of no more than 8 crouched low, his eyes wide as he watched his own lantern drift away. His grandmother's hand rested on his shoulder, guiding him to stand again. In that glow, his gaze seemed older than his years, as though the ritual had passed into him something timeless and unspoken. Around them, the murmurs of the gathered blended with the sigh of the river, a harmony too gentle to be called a song, yet too deliberate to be called silence. A low wind traced its way down the banks, carrying with it the rustle of reeds and the faint metallic chime of wind bells hung from the nearest tea house. Somewhere upstream, the taiko drums still sounded, but now they were distant, their deep beats softened by the miles. Here, at the river, the tempo slowed, becoming more like the slow pulse of the night itself. Each lantern was a syllable, a pause, a sigh in the great unspoken language shared between the living and the departed. An elderly man sat on the low wooden dock, his legs folded beneath him in a pose of practiced patience. His lantern was different from the rest, painted with careful strokes of crimson cranes, their wings spread in eternal flight. He did not release it quickly. Instead, he held it a while, his thumb stroking the grain of the wood, his eyes fixed on the flame. It seemed as though he was waiting for some invisible permission, some private moment when the world aligned just so. Then, without fanfare, he let it slip into the water. For a time, he watched it go, but soon the current carried it beyond the reach of his eyes. Across the water, the opposite bank was a mirror image of light and shadow. There, monks from a nearby temple stood with their own lanterns, chanting in low tones. Their words rolled over the water, not quite understood by those unfamiliar with the sutras, yet felt all the same in the marrow. The sound was like the hum of the earth turning, steady, enduring, without beginning or end. The chants and the river seemed to breathe together, the flames of the lanterns flickering in rhythm. The crowd moved slowly, stepping aside for one another, careful not to jostle anyone in the act of release. Children were lifted onto shoulders to watch the lights as they drifted farther away, their reflections doubling and redoubling until the river appeared as a woven ribbon of gold. Somewhere near the bend, the lanterns began to cluster, the current pulling them into a gentle spiral before they broke apart again, each continuing its solitary journey. From the shadows, a pair of musicians began to play, one with a bamboo flute, the other with a koto. The flute's voice was a thread of pure air, bending and dipping like the flight of a crane, while the koto's strings shimmered like moonlight scattered on ripples. The melody was unhurried, neither beginning nor ending, as though it had been flowing since before the first lantern touched the water. Those nearest to the musicians paused, turning toward the sound, but even those far downstream felt its presence, a companion to the drifting lights. A family of 3, mother, father, and daughter, knelt together at the water's edge. The mother held the lantern steady while the father lit the flame, shielding it from the wind with his hand. The daughter, no more than 5, leaned close to watch, her eyes reflecting the light as if she were keeping it safe inside herself. Together, they lowered it into the water, and the little girl let out a breath, as though the act had carried away something she could not yet name. The mother placed her hand on her daughter's back, a silent reassurance that whatever had been released was now part of the river's keeping. The soundscape was layered, the soft plash of water against wood, the sigh of wind in the reeds, the occasional call of a night heron lifting into the air. In the distance, the bridge stood as a dark silhouette against the sky, its stone arches crowned with a line of lanterns that seemed suspended between the realms of earth and sky. From that vantage, the entire river could be seen, a slow-moving constellation of light threading its way through the city. One man stood upon the bridge, holding a camera, yet after a moment he lowered it without taking a photograph. Some scenes, he realized, were not meant to be captured, but lived. He leaned on the railing instead, the cool stone beneath his palms, and watched the lanterns drift until they were swallowed by the bend of the river. The night deepened, and still more lanterns joined the procession. Each was different, some plain and white, others painted with delicate flowers, still others inscribed with calligraphy. Some flames burned steady, others flickered wildly, as if eager to hurry along. A few went out entirely, yet the paper shells continued to drift. Pale ghosts carried onward. The current accepted them all without judgment, weaving them into the same journey. As the hours passed, the crowd thinned, though the river remained alight. Those who stayed moved more slowly now, their voices softer, their steps measured. The air cooled, and the scent of the river grew stronger, mingled with the faint sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. Fireflies appeared along the reeds, their brief sparks answering the lanterns with a rhythm all their own. At the farthest visible point, where the river curved toward the unseen, the lanterns seemed to dissolve into darkness. It was said by some that they did not simply vanish, but crossed into another realm, that the river carried them to the threshold between the living and the spirit world. Whether or not it was true, the thought comforted many, for it meant that no prayer was ever truly lost. One last lantern, small, painted with a single moonflower, drifted alone at the rear of the procession. It had been set afloat by a young woman, who now stood with her arms folded against the night air. She watched until it disappeared, and then she turned back toward the narrow lane that would lead her home. In her wake, the river kept moving, carrying her wish among countless others, each a point of light against the deep, endless dark. And so the river of reflections flowed on, year after year, night after night, its surface a map of fleeting light and eternal hope. For those who had stood upon its banks tonight, the sight would remain, a memory carried quietly, like the echo of a song one could never quite forget. The hour had grown late, though here by the river time seemed to stretch and fold upon itself. The voices along the banks had softened to murmurs, and the bustle of Kyoto's streets was now a distant echo. The night was cool, the air heavy with the lingering scent of incense, jasmine, and faint traces of cedar smoke from the vendors who had packed away their grills hours earlier. The lanterns that had been set adrift earlier in the evening were now far downstream, their numbers thinned, but their glow no less tender. What remained near the release point were the final offerings, the last lights of the night. They waited in the hands of those who had chosen to linger until the end, each person seeming to carry a quiet determination to send their light not with the press of the crowd, but with the deep stillness that the late hour afforded. The river, dark and glassy beneath the moon, seemed even more patient now. The gentle current whispered along its course, drawing delicate ripples around the stones near the banks. Occasionally the wind would brush across the surface, bending the lantern reflections into shimmering ribbons, as if the water were reluctant to let the images go. Near a low wooden pier, a woman in her 70s stood with her grandson. She held a lantern painted with 3 camellia blossoms, their petals rendered in careful strokes of crimson and white. Her grandson, not yet tall enough to see fully over the railing, stood on tiptoe to watch the river. She crouched, showing him how to place the lantern in the water without tipping it. He listened intently, then took the lantern in both hands, holding it with exaggerated care. When he finally released it, the flame steadied itself and began its slow drift away. The boy's eyes followed it until it was swallowed by the soft, dark downstream. Behind them, the deep, resonant tone of a temple bell rolled across the water. The monks had emerged again, their silhouettes lined against the lantern-lit temple steps. They stood in a loose row, each holding their own lantern, and one by one they began to lower them into the water. With each release, a verse of chanting followed, the words flowing in unison like a second current atop the first. The chant was low and unhurried, and though its meaning was ancient and complex, it carried a simple truth, a blessing for safe passage, a farewell without sorrow. On the opposite bank, the musicians had grown quiet, but now a single shakuhachi player lifted his flute. The notes rose, soft and pure, seeming to drift over the water like invisible threads weaving among the lanterns. The melody was neither joyful nor mournful. It simply was, a sound both present and timeless. The last vendors were closing their stalls, their lantern signs dimming one by one. The smell of grilled fish and sweet bean cakes faded into memory, replaced by the scent of damp grass and river mist. Most of the festival goers had left for the warmth of their homes, yet a certain kind of pilgrim remained, those who came each year, not for the spectacle, but for the quiet communion of these final hours. A man in a dark indigo yukata approached the riverbank with his lantern tucked under his arm. He knelt, placing it in the water without haste, his fingers lingering on the rim as though reluctant to let it go. He did not stand immediately. Instead, he remained crouched, watching it join the others. His posture spoke of someone sending off more than just paper and light, perhaps a farewell to a friend, a parent, or even to a younger version of himself. The river now carried only a scattering of lights, each one separated by stretches of darkness. This spacing gave each lantern its own presence, its own moment of solitude before merging with the unseen journey ahead. From the bridge, one could see the glow as a constellation unspooling across the water, slowly dissolving into the far bend. Children who had managed to stay awake for this late hour clung to their parents' hands, their eyes heavy yet unwilling to leave until their lantern disappeared from sight. One girl leaned her head against her father's shoulder, her small hand still gripping his as they both watched their flame become a star in the distance. A faint mist began to rise from the river's surface, softening the edges of the lights and giving the scene the quality of a dream. The reflections stretched longer in the water, wavering gently, as if the river itself were sighing in farewell. Near the grassy slope, a couple sat side by side, their bare feet just above the waterline. Between them floated a lantern, painted with a single crane in flight. They watched it silently, their shoulders touching. The man reached over and adjusted the woman's shawl against the night chill. and she smiled faintly without taking her eyes from the river. The temple bell sounded again, once, twice, 3 times, and with each deep toll, the air seemed to grow stiller. The monks began their final chant, slower now, the syllables stretching like the last light of dusk. The words seemed to linger in the mist, wrapping around the remaining lanterns like a blessing. A final family approached the water, parents with 2 young boys. Each boy carried a lantern painted with bright, uneven flowers. Their father crouched between them, helping to light the small candles inside. The boys grinned at the flicker of flame. Then together, they lowered the lanterns into the water. One of the boys clapped his hands in delight as the current caught it. But his father gently placed a hand on his shoulder, a silent reminder of the night's reverence. As the river carried away these last lights, the crowd's numbers dwindled to a handful. Those who stayed did not speak. They simply stood and watched until the final lanterns vanished around the bend. The mist thickened slightly, catching the glow until it seemed the water itself was giving off the light. Eventually, even the final watchers began to drift away, their footsteps soft on the grass and stone paths. The bridge stood in quiet silhouette once more, its earlier crown of festival lanterns now extinguished. The musicians had packed their instruments, the vendors were gone, and the monks returned to the temple. And yet, the river still moved, carrying with it the memory of light long after the last flame had been swallowed by distance. Somewhere beyond sight, the lanterns continued their journey, bobbing gently over the unseen currents, bound for the place where river meets sea and sea meets sky. Those who had stood here tonight would carry the image with them, a map of golden lights drifting into the horizon, each a vessel for a wish, a farewell, a memory. And as the final bell tone faded into the night, the city exhaled, ready to fold this night into its long memory, ready to wait for the lantern's return another year. The night had passed into its deepest hours, and the city of Kyoto slept. The festival grounds, once filled with voices and laughter, lay empty under a canopy of stars. The stalls were closed, their canvas awnings tied down, their signs swaying faintly in the breeze. The bridge loomed like a shadow over the still river, its wooden planks cooled by the night air. The river was different now. The last lanterns had long since rounded the bend and disappeared into the darkness, carried far toward places unseen. What remained on the water was the silver reflection of the moon, stretched into rippling patterns by the gentle current. The air was cool, almost crisp, and every sound, the rustle of leaves, the creak of a rope on a moored boat, seemed magnified in the stillness. Somewhere far downstream, the lanterns continued their quiet voyage. Perhaps a few had dimmed, their flames flickering out, their paper walls collapsing softly into the water. Others still glowed, their small lights stubborn against the encroaching dawn. No one here could see them now, but knowing they were still traveling lent the night a lingering sense of continuity, as though the festival's spirit had not yet entirely departed. Near the banks, a handful of workers moved silently. They wore dark coats and soft-soled shoes, their breath visible in the cool air. They carried long bamboo poles, gently hooking debris from the water, not the lanterns, for those were left to travel, but stray blossoms, bits of festival paper, and small wooden charms that had fallen from pockets. They moved slowly, respecting the river even in its emptiness, as if it were still holding the weight of the night's emotions. On the far shore, the temple stood watch in silence. The great lanterns that had illuminated its steps were now dark, their paper shades pale and ghost-like in the moonlight. Inside, a single candle still burned in the main hall, casting long shadows against the carved wood pillars, The monks slept, their chanting voices from earlier now folded into the memory of the night. In a small house just beyond the temple walls, an elderly calligrapher stirred from his desk. He had attended the festival earlier, sending off his lantern with a prayer for his late wife. Now, in the quiet hours before dawn, he picked up his brush once more. He dipped it in ink and began to write on a fresh sheet of washi paper, not a prayer this time, but a poem. The words came slowly, each stroke deliberate, as if the brush itself still remembered the rhythm of the monk's chant. The poem was not for anyone to read. It was for the river, for the night, for the journey of the lanterns. Farther upriver, where the lanterns had first been set afloat, the grass was flattened in places where crowds had gathered. The scent of trampled wildflowers rose faintly from the earth. Here, the riverbank was dotted with small pools of light from fireflies, still active despite the late hour. One landed briefly on the edge of a wooden post, its glow pulsing in the darkness like the smallest lantern of all. The first hint of dawn began as a pale band on the eastern horizon. It was subtle at first, a cool light that softened the blackness of the sky. The stars began to fade, one by one, until only the brightest lingered above the silhouette of the mountains. The moon hung low, its reflection stretching farther across the river as if reluctant to leave. A fisherman appeared on the bridge, his sandals whispering against the planks. He carried 2 baskets and a coiled net, his breath puffing into the chill. He paused at the center of the bridge, leaning on the railing to look down at the water. For a moment, he thought he saw a faint glimmer far downstream, perhaps the last of the lanterns, but it vanished when the wind shifted. He nodded to himself, as though satisfied, and continued toward the shore. The sound of morning was different from the night's stillness. The river kept its steady whisper, but now there was the occasional call of a bird, the faint stirrings of leaves as a breeze carried the scent of damp earth. In the distance, a rooster crowed, its voice carried over the rooftops of the sleeping city. At the temple, the monks began to stir. They rose in silence, the rustle of their robes barely audible, and gathered in the courtyard. A conch shell horn sounded once, its low, resonant note rolling across the water. They began their morning prayers, their voices rising into the cool air. This chant was different from the night's, lighter, more open, a greeting rather than a farewell. Down by the riverbank, a lone woman arrived carrying a small bundle. She unwrapped it to reveal a folded paper lantern, unlit. She knelt by the water and with a small bow placed it on the surface. The candle inside was cold, but the lantern drifted anyway, its pale shape carried slowly by the current. She did not light it. It was enough, she seemed to decide, to let it go. The light in the east grew stronger, painting the edges of the clouds with silver and pale gold. The mist along the river began to lift, curling upward and dispersing into the warming air. The mountains took on shape and color, their dark outlines softening into greens and blues. The rooftops of Kyoto caught the first slants of sunlight, tiles glinting faintly. Vendors began to reappear in the streets, setting up for the morning market. The scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery mingled with the sharper aroma of pickled vegetables. Bicycles rattled over the cobblestones, their riders heading toward the city center. The festival was gone from the streets, but its echo remained in the quiet smiles of those who had seen the lanterns drift away. Back at the river, the fisherman's boat pushed away from the shore. His oar dipped into the water with a soft rhythm, sending ripples across the reflection of the sky. A crane flew overhead, its wings catching the morning light, its shadow sliding silently over the water. The calligrapher, having finished his poem, stepped outside to hang it on a line where the breeze could dry the ink. He stood for a moment, watching the sun crest the ridge of the mountains. The warmth touched his face, and he closed his eyes. Somewhere deep in his memory, he could still see his lantern drifting away in the dark, carrying his words into the unknown. The city was waking, but the river kept its own time. The lanterns, now far beyond the bend, were part of another landscape, perhaps bobbing in the open sea, their flames still alive or long since extinguished. It did not matter. They had done their work, carrying wishes and memories away, freeing those who released them to step into the new day. As the sun climbed higher, the festival of the previous night seemed like a dream, vivid but fleeting. Yet its meaning lingered in the air, woven into the fabric of the city like the scent of incense in the beams of the temple hall. And when evening came again, the river would still be there, waiting, as it always had, for the next year's lights to return. The fisherman hauled in his first catch of the day. The monks bowed to the rising sun. The calligrapher returned to his desk, and the woman with the unlit lantern walked slowly back into the city. Above them all, the sky deepened into blue, and the day began in earnest. And so the Lantern Festival passed into memory, not as an end, but as a circle. The light returning to the darkness yielding to the dawn, and the river holding it all, year after year. The final lantern drifts away, its glow folding into the night like a fading ember. The streets are emptier now. The music and chatter have softened into a gentle murmur that the wind will carry away before morning. Somewhere behind closed shoji screens, the tea has been poured, and weary feet are resting after a long night's walk. We stand at the edge of the river one last time. The water holds the reflection of the moon, steady and silver, as if to remind us that even when the lanterns are gone, the night still keeps its light. There is no rush to leave. Kyoto breathes in slow rhythm, the same as you, and the stillness settles around us like a warm shawl. The path home is quiet, lined with the faint glow of lanterns that will soon be extinguished until next year's festival. And yet, the memory of this night will remain. The colors, the scents, the way the air felt cool against your skin as the lights shimmered on the water. You carry it with you now. And as your eyes grow heavier and the edges of the world begin to blur, you may find yourself still walking these streets in a dream. The paper lanterns swaying gently above, their soft light showing you the way long after the festival has ended. Rest well, traveler. The night will keep your story safe. Until next time, may peace steep quietly into the corners of your evening. Good night. The people here